thank you in advance for your patience with your listening. I'm not going to be presenting you any visual stuff to look at, which is perhaps appropriate given the nature of my remarks. I've prepared some thoughts about theater, presence, community, and the age of virtuality. I want to start by proposing that we are living in an era of what we could call industrial storytelling, by which I mean storytelling at the service of an increasingly synchronized, interconnected global marketplace. I say industrial because it is an industry now, this production of stories consumed on the screens proliferating across the entire world. Images are the currency in which this storytelling industry conducts its business. For images ever simpler, ever more forceful images dissolve differences of language and culture, cross national borders, and facilitate commerce. Indeed, the seemingly inexhaustible store of ever more graphic and gripping images of bodies, blood, beauty, only seem to take even more complete hold of the global viewer's attention, whoever and wherever she may be. Some have suggested that this, let us call it, regime of the image, has altered the nature of the world's attention. Some have spoken of it as a shallowing of consciousness, of discourse, of empathy, or as a death of nuance, of deep thinking, of literary culture. Others still posit that we are beholden to our screens like sleepwalkers lost in a waking dream, likening our enslavement to the image to the parable of Plato's cave, in which a captive humanity confuses shadows on a wall with the great wide world outside. Stories feeding the growing hunger for stories, the growing hunger of an exponentially growing number of consumers across more and more distribution streams, and all of it occurring at only increasing velocities. In this age of virtuality, the ease of consumption, not making demands on the cognitive function or the sedentary tendencies of the consumer, ease of consumption enables monetization. The simpler, the more proximal the points of purchase and consummation, the more likely the sale. Indeed, the global mass production of stories, which are no longer even called stories, but now referred to simply as content, the global mass production of content is worth a daily fortune. A fortune to those who control their production, and more importantly, their dissemination. A dissemination affected, as I suggested earlier, mostly on screens, less and less on pages, and even less on stages. The one thing almost every professional practitioner of the theater knows is that there isn't much money in it. It can seem like a daily miracle that the form survives at all. A poor, outmoded passion hobbling along, its old-fangled ways catching uncomfortably in the quick silver channels of industrial exploitation. How can the theater compete? It makes demands on reality. It's not easy to get to. It's not easy to consume. Once it starts, you can't stop it. It requires a room. It requires people in that room. It defies anonymity, forces contact. Defined by presence, the presence of performers and those gathered to observe them, the theater constellates the situation itself of dialogue and can create, however fleetingly, a living relationship. In other words, the theater is an art form scaled to the human, and stubbornly so. Its reliance on presence a large part of why, as a form, it is so difficult to monetize. It cannot be copied and sold. It does not exist to be pulled out at a consumer's whim or discretion. It only happens here and now. Defined by quiddity, the theater admits little, even no, virtuality. The great German literary critic Walter Benjamin might have been pleased to know, some 80 years after his seminal essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, that the theater would remain an art form, perhaps the only one, seemingly immune to the denaturing of facsimile. We are social, herding animals. Even in our solitude, we seek our sense of ourselves, our identities, by recourse to notions of the groups we imagine belonging to: Democrats, Republicans, drama nerds, Yankee fans. Indeed, at some very fundamental level, we humans are wired to feel and think together with others as one mind, one body. We see the worst tendencies of collective emotion every election cycle. We see it in mob mentalities, but there is a more encouraging pole to this tendency in our human being: the capacity to weep and wonder and feel together in the gripping hold of word and story. In a theater, we, congregating creatures, gather before a live inaction, living, breathing performer. It can awake the collective recollection of something more primordial, a reminder of religious ritual, religious rites, the act of gathering to hear word spoken, to witness the myth of our alleged origin performed. This lingering memory, this potentiality is at the root of the theater's timeless magic, a form that can reach into us and make us feel together more deeply than we can when we are alone. When Aristotle talks about catharsis in tragedy, he is talking about the collective experience of an audience gathered in the Athenian theater, specifically in his case, the festival of Dionysia and the performance of the Greek tragedies. He defines the experience of these tragedies as a catharsis, what he calls the expression of emotion through the arousal of pity and terror. Pity and terror. Pity, the emotion that unites us to the suffering one. Terror, the emotion that unites us to the secret cause of that suffering. Terror is the part that is often forgotten, a productive fear verging on religious awe. Aristotle isn't just talking about shedding a tear or two. This is not the noble, urbane, sophisticated stirring of emotion we are used to from our own milder experiences of aesthetic catharsis. He is talking about a depth of emotion commensurate with our tremendous vulnerability to existence itself. Think of the sobbing thousands, the rivers of tears shed, for example, during the Passion Play performances of Tazia in Iran. Or at the opposite end of the spectrum, a terror verging on a kind of sublime awe, the life-altering ecstasy described by so many who saw the Peter Brook production of Midsummer Night's Dream. All are examples that point to the true underlying strength of the theater's enduring hold, its capacity to summon emotion that lies beyond our individuality, beyond our isolate notions of ourselves, our differences. The theater's capacity, to bind, to sweep us along on a current that flows into the heart of the deepest truth, that we are all one. I want to share an anecdote from a stay in London a few years back. I had a play of my own going up at a theater there, and I had spent an afternoon away from rehearsal at the Old Vic to see a production of The Winslow Boy. The play is about that prized British idea of fair play. A young boy is wrongfully accused of theft at his school. His father empties the family coffers to defend the boy's honor. In the end, fair play wins out. The British audience that afternoon was witness to the gripping fulfillment of that enduring truth that, yes, British values will ultimately prevail. The production was wonderful, and here we were gathered in one of the great temples to that illustrious art, the English theater. After the ovations, there was a palpable ebullience, a wave of assurance that had infused the audience with a sense of hope, collective well-being. You could almost touch it in the air. Was it perhaps a hair's breadth from jingoism? Maybe. And yet the episode was also an object lesson for me in the capacity of the theater to build a sense of collective identity through emotional experience. The presence of a living audience the presence of living performers in dialogue with that audience. This is the theater. A feedback loop, a living exchange, a living relationship. And one in which that afternoon at the Old Vic in London, the story and its values penetrated us all in a different way, a deeper way, and made us feel like a community. An experience I would have a few months later on Broadway when I was carried along by a similar collective vibrancy at the Belasco during the Mark Rylance productions of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night and Richard III. Evenings that made me unable to resist reaching out to my fellow audience members during and after the show to share my wonder and enthusiasm, and in one case, over coffee at the cafe next door, with people I didn't even know before the show. Presence, relationship, community. These are the values embodied by the theater, by the nature of its form. And these are the values that speak to why there will never be a true crisis in the form, why it will always speak to us, why it will always endure. As a very brilliant and pessimistic friend of mine once said, long after there's little left but the wasteland that we have wrought upon our planet, there will be a troupe that steps out onto the massive trash heap to tell us the story of how it all happened. I am a little more hopeful than that. Thank you.